Women of the Old Bailey. Domestic Lives on Trial in Victorian London. Written by Alana Sanchez. Narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Preface. The Old Bailey is often remembered as a stage for London's worst offences, a place of crowds and spectacle, of sharp questions and sharper sentences, of lives reduced to a few printed lines. In the Victorian years it was also something more ordinary and more intrusive. It was a machine that took private life, marriage, illness, service, motherhood, household authority, and converted it into public evidence. For women, that conversion carried particular force. A woman did not enter the central criminal court as a neutral subject. She entered as a type before she was proven as a defendant: wife, servant, nurse, mother, respectable woman, fallen woman. These roles were not merely social. They shaped how the court listened and what it expected to hear. The same conduct could be read differently depending on whether the woman was seen as respectable or suspect, steady or unstable, properly feminine or dangerously unfeminine. A Victorian trial did not only decide what happened. It decided what kind of woman could have made it happen, and that decision could harden long before a verdict was delivered. This book follows that hardening. It is a narrative history drawn from the surviving record of the Old Bailey and the public language that surrounded it. The aim is not to recover full interior lives the archive cannot reliably provide, nor to soften real harms into sociological abstraction. The aim is to watch the court at work, the questions it asked, the details it repeated, the assumptions it treated as common sense, and the silences it permitted. In doing so, the book traces a particular Victorian habit, one that appears across case after case, of treating women's character as evidence, women's bodies as proof, and women's domestic roles as both obligation and danger. The Old Bailey's women were frequently tried on two levels at once. There was the formal trial: charges, testimony, exhibits, expert opinion, judges summing up. Alongside it ran another trial that was less openly acknowledged but just as influential, the trial of credibility and femininity. A woman could be disbelieved for the wrong kind of emotion and distrusted for the right kind. Calmness could be called cold. Tears could be called theatre. A working woman's practicality could be turned into calculation. A respectable woman's composure could be treated as concealment. The courtroom's gaze was never passive. It was an instrument of interpretation. Because so much of women's alleged offending was tied, directly or indirectly, to the home becomes a central character in these pages. The Victorian household was idealized as a moral sanctuary, yet the court repeatedly entered it as a crime scene. In the record, bedrooms, kitchens, stair landings, sick rooms, nurseries, and back rooms become evidence fields. Keys, bottles, letters, meals, bedclothes, parcels, and small sums of money are lifted into meaning. Domestic life is flattened into a sequence the law can manage: who had access, who controlled food, who administered medicine, who moved through the rooms, who benefited, who lied. The book is structured around 7 major cases, each returning through multiple chapters rather than appearing once and disappearing. Together they form a composite picture of how Victorian justice handled women when domestic life could no longer be kept private. Catherine Wilson, the nurse whose proximity to illness and household trust made her a figure of suspicion. Adelaide Bartlett, the respectable wife whose trial shows how the court dissects a lady defendant to restore plausibility. Kate Webster, the servant whose access to private space became both her livelihood and her alleged opportunity. Mary Piercy, the sensational defendant shaped into public warning as much as legal subject. Christiana Edmonds, whose case reveals how motive and mind can merge into diagnosis. Amelia Dyer, whose crimes expose both individual horror and the moral economy that created a hidden market in infants. The Penge case, where household cruelty is tried through routine, deprivation, and the slow violence of control. These cases have been chosen not simply for notoriety, but for what they preserve about women's treatment within the criminal process: the weaponizing of respectability, the classing of credibility, the way domestic work becomes dangerous access, the authority granted to medical and expert voices, the court's hunger for motives that keep social comfort intact, and the record's repeated difficulty in holding coercion, dependence, fear, and shame as real forms of context. Some readers come to the Old Bailey seeking the drama of crime. This book is less interested in drama than in mechanism. The court's language and procedures are themselves the story, how they sort women, how they teach the public what to believe about women, and how they deliver moral endings that often outlast the facts. The Old Bailey archive does not merely preserve offenses. It preserves a culture of judging. What follows is written in the knowledge that the record is partial. It favors certain voices. It records what the law needed and often neglects what a life would have wanted preserved. Yet even in those limits it is revealing. When a system repeatedly narrows women into types, the narrowing becomes visible. It can be traced. It can be named. This book begins at that point, with the Old Bailey's habit of taking a woman's private life and making it public, and with what Victorian justice did to women in the act of deciding what they were. Principal figures and cases. Catherine Wilson, nurse, carer, accused poisoner. At a glance, a working woman employed in private homes at the point of crisis, illness, exhaustion, fear of death, fear of scandal. Background: Wilson earned her living through intimate labor. A nurse's work was not sentimental in practice, it was practical and bodily. It required presence at night, management of food and medicine, and closeness to patients when families were too tired to watch every small act. Nursing also carried an uneasy status, necessary, yet never fully trusted, inside respectable homes, yet not securely protected by their respectability. The case: allegations of poisoning linked to sick rooms where Wilson had access. These cases are built from domestic detail: who administered the dose, who handled bottles and powders, who was alone with the patient, what symptoms appeared and when, then stabilized by medical testimony and the court's appetite for a motive that makes the invisible feel real. How the court tends to frame her, as a betrayer of trust. Competence becomes capability, calm becomes coldness, access becomes suspicion. Her wage-earning position makes money motive easy for the court to install. Why she matters in this book: Wilson anchors the book's core anxiety, the trusted working woman inside the home. Her case shows how the Old Bailey converts care into opportunity, and opportunity into character. Adelaide Bartlett, respectable wife, the puzzle defendant. At a glance, a woman presented as respectable, prosecuted in a case that forced the court to prosecute not only an alleged act but a social contradiction. Background: Bartlett's public position, married, respectable, made her case culturally volatile. Victorian justice relied on the comfort of visible categories: good women and bad women, orderly homes and disordered ones. A lady defendant threatened that comfort. Respectability could provide allies and restraint in language, but it also invited a deeper dissection of private life in search of plausibility. The case: accused in connection with the poisoning death of her husband. The trial became an audit of marriage and privacy, relationships, confidences, domestic arrangements, possible impropriety, and the question of who held influence within the household. Expert testimony and careful courtroom tone sit beside the underlying pressure to explain how a respectable woman could be involved in a crime. How the court tends to frame her, as a problem to be solved. If she appears too composed, composure becomes concealment. If she appears distressed, distress becomes performance. The court hunts for a hidden motive that preserves the idea of respectability while allowing prosecution to proceed. Why she matters in this book: Bartlett shows respectability as a double-edged instrument, capable of softening contempt while intensifying scrutiny. Her case demonstrates how the Old Bailey can violate private life most thoroughly when the defendant looks least like a criminal. Kate Webster, servant, outsider inside the home. At a glance, a domestic servant tried within a system that often treated class as plausibility. Background: servants lived at the threshold of respectable life. They moved through private rooms, handled possessions, heard conversations, and learned routines, yet remained socially disposable. Victorian households depended on servants, while fearing what servants could see and touch. That fear becomes especially potent once wrongdoing is alleged, because access can be narrated as temptation and knowledge as threat. The case: accused of murdering her employer. The prosecution narrative in such cases often builds a map of domestic opportunity: rooms, routines, timings, objects, movements through the house. The servant's position supplies a ready-made story of motive: greed, resentment, appetite, whether or not such feelings can be proven. How the court tends to frame her, as plausible early and harshly. Her speech, posture, and lack of respectable witnesses can be treated as moral evidence. Even neutrality can be read as hardness or insolence. Why she matters in this book: Webster exposes the Old Bailey's classed gaze. Her case shows how a working-class woman can be tried not only for an alleged act but for the social anxiety she represents, the servant who knows too much and stands too close to the household's privacy. Mary Piercy, the sensational woman as public warning. At a glance, a defendant shaped by notoriety and consumed as story as much as prosecuted as fact. Background: some female defendants became part of a public genre: the wicked woman, the unnatural woman, the domestic monster. Newspapers and public talk fed expectations that a trial then had to satisfy. In these cases, a woman's appearance and demeanor are treated as evidence of the sort of person she is, and the law's procedures operate under the pressure of public appetite for moral closure. The case, accused of murder within a domestic/relationship context, frequently framed in familiar Victorian motives: jealousy, rivalry, improper desire, because these motives are culturally comfortable explanations for women. The trial's tone can become as decisive as its facts. How the court tends to frame her, as type rather than person. Calm becomes chilling. Tears become acting. Denial becomes cunning. Once the monster frame is installed, doubt becomes harder to tolerate. Why she matters in this book, Piercy demonstrates how the courtroom can become part of spectacle. Her case shows punishment beginning in language, how narrative can convict in the public imagination before the legal process concludes. Christiana Edmonds, Poison, Obsession, and the Medicalized Woman. At a glance, a case where motive, mind, and proof interlock, and a woman's inner life is used to stabilize an invisible crime. Background: poisoning unsettled Victorian justice because it hid behind ordinary illness and ordinary consumption. When the act cannot be seen, the court seeks stability through expert voices and through a motive that feels inevitable. For women, that motive is often framed as emotional excess, fixation, jealousy, obsession, qualities Victorian culture was ready to locate in female nature or female nerves. The case, accused of attempted poisoning associated with adulterated sweets. The evidence depends on science and inference, but the story depends heavily on how the defendant's mind is narrated. Letters, patterns, and behaviour become proof of both motive and instability, and medical language can overtake the woman's own account. How the court tends to frame her, as a mind rather than a person. Obsession becomes destiny, denial becomes symptom, explanation becomes diagnosis. Why she matters in this book, Edmonds shows how easily women's motives are medicalized in court, and how treatment can function as a way of removing a woman from public life under the banner of managing danger. Amelia Dyer, Baby Farming and the Hidden Economy of Shame. At a glance, a defendant whose crimes sit at the intersection of individual cruelty and systemic desperation. Background: baby farming flourished in the shadows of poverty, illegitimacy stigma, and the lack of social support for women pressured to conceal pregnancies or surrender infants. Women's domestic lives were policed by moral judgment, and that judgment created markets for secrecy. Dyer operated within that economy, exploiting the desperate bargains other women were forced to make. The case, accused of killing infants entrusted to her for payment. The horror of the offenses demanded a definitive moral response, and the court's narrative tends to isolate Dyer as monstrosity, an ending that satisfies public outrage but can leave the enabling social conditions less examined. How the court tends to frame her, as the vessel for collective disgust. Motive is reduced to wickedness and greed. Complexity is refused because understanding feels like contamination. Why she matters in this book, Dyer's case reveals how the Old Bailey can clean a social wound by placing it inside one woman. It also forces the book's most uncomfortable question: what does a society create when it turns women's reproductive reality into shame and secrecy? The Penge case, the Staunton affair and the prosecution of slow cruelty. At a glance, a household case in which harm accumulated through control, deprivation, and isolation rather than a single dramatic act. Background: the Penge case centers on Harriet Staunton and the domestic system that confined her. Multiple adults were prosecuted, including Alice Rhodes, and the court faced a problem it often struggled to handle: cruelty delivered through routine. Where harm is slow, responsibility can be shared and hidden inside ordinary household management. The case, allegations of murder or manslaughter built from domestic facts: food controlled, movement restricted, visitors managed, medical help delayed, suffering relabeled as illness or temperament. The court turns rooms, keys, meals, and daily decisions into a ledger of intention. How the court tends to frame it, as a moral diagram of a household, searching for organizing figures. Women can be judged with particular intensity because Victorian culture expects them to manage the home's moral economy. When the home becomes a site of cruelty, that expectation becomes a weapon. Why it matters in this book. The Penge case shows the Old Bailey prosecuting what it would rather not name, domestic power as a system. It also reveals how easily women are punished for domestic failure, whether as organizers, enforcers, or the ones who did not prevent harm. Chapter 1. The Old Bailey, the Prison, and the Making of a Woman's Story. The first thing the Old Bailey does is rename a life. A woman steps into the machinery already translated, her name written down, her age fixed, her occupation reduced to a single word that carries a world of assumptions: servant, wife, nurse, widow. An address, an allegation, a date. A charge that stands in for everything that came before it. From that point, the court's work is to turn whatever happened, however tangled, private, and human, into a story that can end in one of two words: guilty, not guilty. In Victorian London, that story rarely belongs to the woman. The court and its shadow. The Old Bailey is often described as a court, but it operates more like a corridor. It connects the street to custody, the household to public judgment, the private self to the official record. For much of the Victorian era, Newgate Prison sits hard against the court, close enough to make the relationship between confinement and judgment feel continuous. A woman is held, brought out, returned. She waits in a place known for dread while her life is reorganized on paper. By the time she is seen in open court, she has already been handled, searched, recorded, contained, and rendered into an object of administrative certainty. The record does not always dwell on this, but the silence is telling. Custody is treated as normal, as though the taking of a body is merely the beginning of a story, not a violence in itself. This is how the Old Bailey's treatment often begins, not with verdict or sentence, but with being taken into the system where other people decide what you are. The public ritual of judgment. A Victorian courtroom insists on order. The judge above, the counsel speaking, the jury watching, the clerk writing, the witnesses stepping forward one by one. It is a ritual designed to produce calm authority. Whatever disorder exists outside, poverty, drink, marital cruelty, desperate love, illness, hunger, is meant to become manageable here. Yet the courtroom is not a neutral machine. It is a cultural space, and culture brings expectations. A man's wrongdoing is often framed as conduct. A woman's wrongdoing is framed as nature. The court listens for the facts, but it also listens for the kind of woman it thinks it is hearing, respectable or not, steady or volatile, truthful or sly, sane or unsound. Those judgments leak into the process through questions that seem ordinary. What is her character? Does she drink? What sort of company does she keep? Was she a good wife? Was she quiet? Was she respectable? These are not side issues. They are a second trial that runs underneath the first. Case thread: Catherine Wilson, the trusted hand. A nurse belongs to the private world. She is employed to step into it. Catherine Wilson moves between households as a paid carer. She is admitted into sick rooms where the body is weak and the family is anxious. She is trusted with tasks that require intimacy: preparing food, administering remedies, handling linen, sitting through the night, keeping watch when others sleep. If there is money to be managed, wages, little gifts, debts, promises, she can be near that too, because sickness often rearranges a household's practical life. When a case like Wilson's reaches the Old Bailey, the courtroom is not only judging an alleged act. It is judging a breach of the domestic order, care turned into access turned into opportunity. The offense, as the court frames it, is not simply harm. It is betrayal, and betrayal is one of the easiest things for a jury to feel certain about. The trial record in such cases tends to do the same thing early and decisively. It converts a woman's work into suspicion. The movements that make a nurse useful, entering a room at night, measuring a dose, insisting on managing medicine herself, can be reframed as control. Competence becomes capability. Calmness becomes coldness. Familiarity with sickness becomes knowledge of how to produce it. The court does not have to say aloud that it distrusts women in intimate roles. It shows it by how quickly it turns domestic detail into accusation. Case thread: Adelaide Bartlett, the respectable defendant. A different kind of woman produces a different kind of courtroom tension. Adelaide Bartlett presents as respectable, a woman whose manner and class position challenge the easy assumption that crime lives only in certain streets and bodies. When a woman like Bartlett is accused, the courtroom does not simply assemble evidence. It assembles plausibility. Respectability can function as armor. It can buy interpretive charity, the presumption that the accused is not that sort of person. Yet it also invites a particular fascination. If a respectable woman is accused of a serious offense, the court becomes hungry to find the hidden stain that makes the charge feel believable: an affair, a secret vice, a moral weakness, an illness of mind. The trial can turn into an audit, stripping privacy in search of a reason that satisfies the public. The Old Bailey's treatment here is subtler than contempt, but it is still a form of handling. A respectable woman may be protected from some kinds of language while being subjected to deeper scrutiny. The court works to preserve the social idea of the respectable home even as it prosecutes what allegedly happened inside it. Case thread: Kate Webster, the servant inside the house. The servant's body moves through a household, but her status does not. Kate Webster occupies a position that Victorian courts treat with constant suspicion, inside respectable homes, not of them, close enough to see routines and valuables, not close enough to be granted full trust. Servants are frequently accused of theft because they have access and because class prejudice makes the accusation easy to believe. When a servant is accused of a more serious offense, the court's reading can turn quickly from suspicion to disgust. The record often treats working-class women as plausible for wrongdoing in a way it does not always treat comfortable women. Their poverty becomes moral evidence. Their anger becomes temperament. Their speech becomes a marker of vulgarity or unreliability. The household itself becomes a measuring device, and the servant is measured against a standard that was never built for her to meet. Webster's case sits in the background of this book as a reminder that treatment is not only gendered. It is gendered through class. The printed record and the afterlife of tone. The Old Bailey does not end when the judge leaves the bench. Victorian trials travel. They become published accounts, newspaper reports, retellings, warnings, entertainment. The record fixes not only facts but tone, the adjectives applied to a woman, the insinuations allowed to hang in the air, the moral conclusions offered as though they are simply common sense. This is how some women become infamous. Not only because of what they are said to have done, but because the courtroom's language teaches the public how to read them. Mary Piercy's notoriety shows this mechanism in its harshest form. A sensational case involving a woman can become a template: the wicked woman, the unnatural woman, the deceptive woman. Once a template exists, other women can be poured into it more easily. The Old Bailey record becomes part of the apparatus by which society learns which women deserve pity and which deserve punishment before the verdict is even spoken. The courtroom's preferred endings. A Victorian criminal court is built to deliver clarity. The lives it receives are rarely clear. Domestic violence, illness, dependency, coercion, poverty, these are conditions, not isolated events. The court prefers events. It prefers beginnings and endings. It prefers motives that can be named in a single word. It prefers women who can be sorted into categories that feel morally satisfying: the respectable woman led astray, the servant corrupted by bad company, the nurse who abused trust, the mad woman who must be contained, the monster who must be made an example. This is the Old Bailey's real work: legibility. It takes what is ambiguous in life and makes it formal. It takes what is private and makes it public. It takes what is human and makes it evidence. In the process, women are treated not only as defendants but as objects of interpretation, handled through assumptions about what women are for and what women are capable of when they step outside their assigned role. The chapters that follow stay close to that handling. They return to case after case, not to collect shock for its own sake, but to watch the machinery repeat its habits, and to trace what those habits did to women whose lives were made, in the Old Bailey's hands, into stories that could end cleanly even when nothing else about them was clean at all. Chapter 2: The Woman Behind the Charge. A Victorian indictment names an offense. The courtroom looks for a woman. Before a jury can feel sure about what happened, it is asked, quietly, persistently, to decide what sort of person the defendant must be for the allegation to make sense. In practice, this is how certainty is manufactured when domestic life refuses to sit still on the page. The court gathers facts, but it also gathers tone. It collects details that do not prove an act yet shape belief, a reputation, a manner, a kind of femininity performed or refused. This second process is rarely announced. It happens through questions that sound routine. Was she respectable? Did she drink? Was she steady? Was she a woman of good character? Who would vouch for her? Who would not? The answers become a kind of shadow evidence. They do not sit in the exhibit tray, but they move the room. Character as currency. Character evidence is treated as if it belongs to the past. In court it belongs to the future. It is used to predict what a woman is capable of. A respectable woman is granted interpretive space. Her conduct can be framed as shock, error, coercion, illness, misfortune. A woman described as not respectable is denied that space. Her story is made to fit a harsher mold. In this way, character becomes a form of currency that buys patience, belief, and sometimes mercy. It is also a gate. Women who cannot produce the right witnesses, employers, neighbors, husbands, ministers, are left with the courtroom's default assumptions. For many defendants, the trial begins with a deficit. Catherine Wilson, the trust that turns into suspicion. A nurse's work is built on access. Catherine Wilson moves through the most intimate spaces without needing to force her way in. She is invited. She is paid. She is relied upon. Her hands are near food, drink, medicine, letters, bedside drawers, and whatever money is kept within reach. This is what nursing requires. In court, it is what makes the allegation feel plausible. Once suspicion attaches, ordinary competence becomes charged. A woman who insists on giving the dose herself can be framed as attentive or controlling. A woman who sits through the night can be framed as dutiful or opportunistic. A woman who speaks confidently about symptoms can be framed as experienced or rehearsed. The courtroom does not simply ask what Wilson did. It asks what sort of woman moves between homes and learns their habits. It reads mobility as risk. It reads proximity as temptation. It reads paid care as a role that can be used. The result is a quiet transformation. Nurse becomes suspect before the chemistry has even done its work. Adelaide Bartlett, the respectable woman and the audit of privacy. A respectable woman changes the temperature of a courtroom. With Adelaide Bartlett, the case is not only about an alleged act. It becomes about plausibility. The court cannot easily rely on the comforting idea that crime belongs to certain kinds of women. It must build another explanation, one that preserves the social imagination while still allowing prosecution to proceed. In these cases, respectability functions in two contradictory ways. It can shield. It can also provoke a more invasive search for the hidden reason a respectable woman might offend: improper relationships, secret desires, private resentments, an illness of mind, something rotten under a polished surface. The trial becomes an audit. It disassembles marriage, friendship, correspondence, household arrangements, anything that can offer a motive with a moral shape. The courtroom may speak more delicately about a woman like Bartlett, but the intrusion is often deeper. Respectability does not guarantee privacy. It guarantees scrutiny. Kate Webster, class as character, and the servant's plausibility. Where respectability protects, class often prejudges. Kate Webster sits inside a home while remaining outside its status. Servants are surrounded by other people's property, other people's rules, other people's intimacy. When something goes wrong in a household, suspicion naturally looks down the hierarchy. A servant accused of wrongdoing is treated as plausible because the accusation fits what the court is already prepared to believe about poor women, that they are tempted, unstable, ungoverned, and resentful. In such cases, the evidence does not have to work as hard. The woman's station supplies a ready-made story. This is one of the recurring treatments the record reveals. Poverty becomes moral texture. A working-class woman's anger becomes temperament. Her speech becomes evidence of coarseness. Her lack of good character witnesses becomes proof of the very thing it resulted from: social isolation and disposability. The servant is tried not only for her act but for her place. Mary Piercy, the making of a public monster. Some cases arrive already swollen with story. Mary Piercy is one of the women whose trial life extends beyond the courtroom into public appetite. In such cases, the court does not merely decide guilt. It participates in a process of making a woman legible as a warning. The pattern is familiar. Description comes first: her appearance, her composure, her hardness or calmness. Then motive is offered with confidence: jealousy, rivalry, spite, because these motives fit what the era finds believable in women. Character evidence follows, hardening her into a type. Once the type is formed, everything she does in court can be interpreted as confirmation. Tears are acting, calm is coldness, protest is brazenness, silence is defiance. This is not only social theater. It affects how doubt is tolerated. A woman made monstrous is granted less complexity. The courtroom becomes less curious about the conditions around her and more satisfied with the idea that the problem sits inside her nature. The punishment begins in the telling. Christiana Edmonds, Obsession, Poison, and the Medical Handling of Women. When poison enters a case, the courtroom leans toward experts. With Christiana Edmonds, the narrative sits at an uneasy intersection: domestic intimacy, alleged harm delivered through ordinary objects, and a story that invites medical interpretation of a woman's mind. In these trials, character and diagnosis can fold into one another. A woman's behaviour is translated into a pathology, her insistence becomes fixation, her desire becomes disorder. Medical language can appear merciful. It can also remove voice. Once a woman is framed as unstable, her testimony can be treated as less reliable and her motives as less her own. The courtroom is not only deciding what happened. It is deciding whether she is a moral agent or a managed risk. This is a recurring Victorian treatment. When female transgression threatens the domestic ideal, illness is offered as an explanation that keeps the ideal intact while shifting the woman into containment. Amelia Dyer, Respectability's Underside and the Commerce of Desperation. Some women offend within systems that are already cruel. Amelia Dyer's crimes sit in the shadow of poverty, illegitimacy, and the market that formed around women with limited options. Her case forces a confrontation with an uncomfortable truth: Victorian domestic morality produced conditions that could be exploited. The court can treat such a woman as uniquely depraved, and in doing so avoid looking too directly at the social machinery that made her offenses possible. Here character does a different job. It allows the courtroom to isolate blame in a single figure and keep the broader world clean in story. The woman becomes the vessel for public horror. The systems that fed the horror remain, in the record, as background. The treatment is not leniency. It is narrative convenience. The Penge case, when the household itself is tried. Sometimes the defendant is not only a woman. It is a household. In the Penge case, domestic cruelty becomes a kind of collective story: who controlled food, who controlled access, who controlled the sick room, who controlled money, who controlled the victim's movements. Where multiple adults share a home, the court often searches for a single organizing figure to carry the moral meaning. Women can be made to hold that meaning with particular force. A woman framed as organizer of cruelty is treated as an inversion of the domestic ideal, an unnatural woman whose offense seems to pollute the idea of home itself. Even where men are involved, the narrative can lean toward a woman as the household's moral hinge, either the one who should have prevented harm or the one who orchestrated it. This is treatment through role expectation. A woman is punished for failing the duties Victorian culture assigned her, whether or not those duties reflect her actual power within the home. What these cases show before any verdict. Taken together, these women reveal the same recurring courtroom habit: the conversion of a life into a type. The nurse becomes the betrayer. The lady becomes the puzzle that must be explained. The servant becomes the plausible culprit. The sensational defendant becomes the monster. The obsessive woman becomes the patient. The desperate woman becomes the embodiment of depravity. The household becomes a moral diagram, and a woman is placed at its center. These are not simply Victorian prejudices floating above the law. They are practical tools the courtroom uses to make messy private life readable at speed. They determine whose testimony sounds reliable, whose emotions are treated as true, whose motives are treated as obvious, and whose context is permitted to matter. A Victorian trial claims to measure evidence. It also measures womanhood, and the measurement shapes the outcome long before the judge sums up. Chapter 3: The Home Becomes Evidence. A Victorian home is meant to hold its own secrets. It is supposed to contain conflict, swallow shame, absorb hardship, and keep the world outside at a respectful distance. When a case reaches the Old Bailey, the court's first act is to violate that ideal. It opens the household up and treats its contents, its routines, its objects, its relationships, as public material. The result is a particular kind of exposure. A woman's life is not simply discussed. It is dismantled. The Old Bailey record shows this dismantling with relentless consistency across very different women: the nurse moving between sick rooms, the respectable wife whose marriage becomes an exhibit, the servant whose presence inside a home is treated as threat, the sensational defendant whose private life becomes public entertainment, the obsessive woman whose letters and fixations are treated as motive, the baby farmer whose business is read as monstrosity, and the Penge household where cruelty is argued through domestic detail. 7 cases, 7 variations, the same procedure, the home becomes evidence. Catherine Wilson, The Sickroom as a Stage. A sickroom is a place where ordinary power rearranges itself. The patient is weak. The family is anxious and tired. Time becomes structured around doses and symptoms. Whoever controls the medicine and the food controls the rhythm of the day. In such a room, a nurse does not need to dominate in order to matter. She matters by default. When Catherine Wilson is brought before the Old Bailey, the court treats domestic care as an opening for crime. The nurse's ordinary movements, mixing, measuring, administering, become points of suspicion. A spoonful becomes a question. A bottle becomes an exhibit. A dose given at night becomes an opportunity. The court also turns the sickroom into a moral theater. It does not only ask what substance might have been given. It asks what sort of person would use a place of care to harm. Trust, in these narratives, is not a background value. It is part of the charge. This is one reason sickroom cases carry such force in the Victorian imagination. They suggest that safety can be breached without noise. Adelaide Bartlett, Marriage Pulled into the Light. The respectable home promises privacy. A trial breaks that promise. In a case like Adelaide Bartlett's, the court is forced to handle a woman who does not fit its easiest stereotypes. The response is not to treat her gently, but to investigate her more thoroughly. The home becomes an exhibit and marriage becomes testimony. The trial pulls at domestic threads the era preferred to leave untouched: the nature of the relationship, intimacies that are usually unspoken, friendships that raise suspicion, private arrangements that do not fit a neat public story. In these circumstances, respectability functions less as protection and more as a provocation. The court hunts for the hidden explanation that can reconcile the charge with the appearance of propriety. This is a distinct form of treatment. The language may be restrained, but the intrusion is not. A respectable woman can be handled with greater delicacy and greater violation at the same time. Kate Webster, The Servant and the Household's Fear. A servant is a witness to a household's routines. The court can treat that fact as proof of danger. Kate Webster's position, inside a respectable home, not part of its status, makes her especially vulnerable to a particular Victorian suspicion, that poor women are tempted by what they see and resent the life they serve. When a servant is accused of serious wrongdoing, the court is quick to convert her access into motive. Here the home becomes evidence in two directions. The prosecution uses it to show opportunity. She was inside, she knew the routines, she could act unseen. The court uses it to evaluate her as a person. Her behavior is measured against the household standard of proper femininity. This is how class becomes a domestic fact. A woman's station is treated as part of her nature, and the home is treated as the place where that nature becomes visible. Mary Piercy, Private Life Turned into Spectacle. Some households become evidence for a jury. Others become evidence for a crowd. With Mary Piercy, the domestic story, relationships, rivalries, private arrangements, is not merely investigated. It is consumed. The court participates in a broader culture that turns certain women into public warnings, and the home becomes a stage on which that warning is performed. The record's attention lingers where it knows the public lingers: the defendant's appearance, her demeanor, her emotional display or lack of it. Domestic detail is used to satisfy the hunger for motive, often in the easiest forms: jealousy, rivalry, sexual transgression. Once those motives are offered, the household becomes a moral diagram where the woman is placed at the center as the source of disorder. The trial becomes a way to make the private legible as scandal, and scandal is a powerful tool for conviction in tone, if not always in law. Christiana Edmonds, Obsession Installed Inside the Home. Where poisoning is alleged, the home is made to look fragile. A kitchen becomes suspicious. A suite becomes a threat. Ordinary consumption becomes danger. The court responds by dragging domestic life into expert language: doctors, chemists, symptoms, tests. Yet it also drags domestic life into moral interpretation, because poison demands motive to feel real. In Christiana Edmonds' story, obsession becomes a kind of domestic invasion. The court reads her fixation through her movements and her writing. Letters, habits, patterns of thought become evidence not only of motive but of stability. The home, in these cases, becomes a place that can be entered without force, through a purchased item, a delivered package, an offered treat. The treatment here is twofold. The woman is judged as criminal and also handled as a psychological type. The court moves between proof and diagnosis until the two begin to merge. Amelia Dyer, The domestic economy at its darkest edge. Victorian society ties women to the domestic sphere and then punishes them for surviving within its harshest corners. Amelia Dyer's crimes sit within a domestic economy that is already steeped in shame and coercion, illegitimacy, poverty, women pressured to conceal pregnancies, and the informal markets built to manage what society refused to accept. In her case, the home is not a haven but a business environment, one that trades in bodies and silence. The courtroom treats this as monstrosity, and it is. Yet the case also shows how quickly the court isolates blame in a single woman and avoids naming the social conditions that made her enterprise possible. The domestic sphere here is not merely evidence. It is the setting of structural cruelty, and the law's handling of it tends to prefer a clean moral conclusion: she was evil. The household is simplified into a chamber of horror, which makes the wider world easier to keep out of view. The Penge case, when cruelty is argued through objects. In the Penge case, domestic life is not a backdrop. It is the entire field of battle. Food becomes evidence: who ate, who was fed, who was kept short. Keys become evidence: who locked doors, who controlled movement. Beds and rooms become evidence: who was isolated, who was watched. Money becomes evidence: who benefited from deprivation. Medical attention becomes evidence: who called for help, who delayed it. The household is read like a ledger. Each ordinary detail is converted into intention. This is how the Old Bailey tries cases rooted in domestic cruelty, by turning the home into a series of controllable facts that can stand in for the larger reality of power. Women, in this kind of case, are treated with particular intensity because Victorian culture expects them to be the household's moral managers. When they are accused of participating in cruelty, they are framed as inverted figures, women who use domestic authority to harm rather than to care. The judgment is not merely legal. It is symbolic. What the court does with the home. Across these 7 cases, the Old Bailey performs the same act in different registers. It converts domestic life into a public narrative that can bear the weight of a verdict. It does this by taking what is ordinary, food, medicine, letters, keys, bedrooms, money, and making it strange. It does it by treating relationships as motives. It does it by translating women into types that fit the era's moral imagination: the betraying nurse, the puzzling lady, the dangerous servant, the jealous rival, the obsessive poisoner, the baby farmer as monster, the household's female organizer of cruelty. The home is never simply a setting in these stories. It is the evidence field, the moral stage, and the place where Victorian expectations of women are most fiercely enforced. A woman could spend her life inside domestic space and still be treated as if she belonged there only conditionally. The Old Bailey record shows what happens when the condition is judged to have been broken. The door is opened, the private is hauled into light, and the woman is made to stand within a story she no longer controls. Chapter 4: The Respectable Woman as Problem. Respectability is a promise the court wants to believe in. It reassures the public that society can be read at a glance, that virtue leaves visible traces, that decent homes are safe homes, that proper women do not harbor dangerous secrets. Victorian justice is built inside that reassurance. It depends on the idea that most people are governable, and that the home, in particular, is a moral engine. A respectable woman in the dock unsettles that entire arrangement. She is not meant to be here. If she is here, then either the allegation must be wrong, or the woman must be something other than she appears. The courtroom responds by turning her into a problem to be solved. The facts matter, but so does plausibility, and plausibility is built from the era's anxieties about what a proper woman might conceal. In this book, the respectable woman appears most sharply through Adelaide Bartlett, but her shadow falls across the other cases too, because respectability is never merely personal. It is a social verdict that shapes how evidence is heard. Adelaide Bartlett, the trial as a domestic dissection. With Adelaide Bartlett, the courtroom's attention gathers around the contradiction. The case turns on a marriage that is examined as if it were evidence in itself. The court is forced to look at the private world it usually treats as the foundation of public order and ask what was happening inside it. This is not comfortable work, and the discomfort shows in the way the trial hunts for explanation. Respectability cannot simply be accepted as fact. It must be tested, audited, and either confirmed or withdrawn. The audit is invasive in a way that is often disguised by polite language. It examines domestic arrangement: who slept where, who visited, what was said privately, what letters existed, what friendships suggested, what emotions were shown, what emotions were withheld. It examines motive in the forms the court finds easiest to recognize in women: concealed desire, jealousy, manipulation, improper intimacy. A respectable woman is handled, in these cases, as a puzzle. The court treats her as a surface and assumes the truth lies underneath it. Respectability as armor, and as a trap. Respectability can protect a woman in court, but it rarely does so without conditions. It can supply witnesses willing to speak of good character. It can supply a kind of procedural softness, more careful language, less open contempt. It can encourage the jury to imagine that a respectable woman is capable of error but not capable of deliberate harm. Yet the same respectability can become a trap because it raises the stakes of explanation. If she does not fit the charge, the court looks harder for the hidden stain that would make the charge fit. The trial becomes, in effect, an attempt to rescue the worldview that respectability represents. If the court cannot rescue it, it may punish the contradiction. A respectable woman convicted of a serious offense can be framed as doubly dangerous, not only wrong but deceptive, not only criminal but contaminating. Her fall becomes a warning that no appearance can be trusted, which makes the court's moral authority feel necessary again. The respectable home and the fear of hidden disorder. The Victorian home is meant to be stable. Respectability is meant to guarantee that stability. When the court prosecutes a case that emerges from a respectable home, it is forced to treat that home as potentially untrue. The household becomes evidence, and evidence makes the private legible to strangers. The very thing respectability promises to prevent, public exposure, becomes inevitable. This is one reason respectable defendants attract a special kind of narrative pressure. The court wants to show that it can still identify evil even when it wears a decent face. It wants to show that domestic privacy will not defeat public justice. In doing so, it often turns the respectable woman into a symbol, carrying more meaning than any one person should have to carry. The symbolism shapes treatment. A respectable woman is interrogated not only for the act but for what her act would imply about the social order. Catherine Wilson, Inside Respectable Homes, Not Protected by Them. Respectability is not a simple possession. It is a border, and some women live on its edge. Catherine Wilson works inside respectable homes without fully belonging to their world. She is admitted as staff, trusted in function, not necessarily trusted in status. Her proximity is permitted because she is useful. It is not a guarantee of protection. This liminal position leaves her exposed. The court can treat her as a threat precisely because she moves within respectable interiors. Her access becomes an insinuation. She knows too much, sees too much, touches too much. The respectable home, which should be a fortress of virtue, becomes in the courtrooms telling a place vulnerable to invasion by an outsider woman. In this way, respectability operates as a frame that can be turned against the poor. A working woman inside a respectable home can be cast as a contaminant even as she performs the labor that keeps the home respectable. Kate Webster, Respectability used as a measuring stick. For a servant, respectability often functions as a test she is designed to fail. Kate Webster is evaluated against the household standards, not her own conditions. The court looks at the home she served in and treats it as the proper model of order. It then treats her presence within it as either compliance or threat. When wrongdoing is alleged, the servant's access to that home becomes the central fact, and her lack of social standing becomes the moral explanation. A respectable household can produce respectable witnesses. Those witnesses carry weight. The servant rarely has the same weight behind her. Even her speech can be used as evidence against her, too coarse, too bold, too familiar. The courtroom uses respectability as a ruler, and then uses the servant's failure to match it as a reason to distrust her. This is not only gendered treatment. It is gendered through class, and respectability is one of the tools by which class judgment becomes legal atmosphere. Mary Piercy, Respectability withdrawn, then used as proof. In sensational cases, respectability can be something the courtroom strips away. Mary Piercy is shaped in the public imagination as the opposite of respectable womanhood: brazen, immoral, unnatural. Once a woman is cast in that role, respectability does not merely vanish, its absence becomes proof. A woman without respectability is treated as capable of anything because she is already treated as outside the moral order. This is how the court uses the concept as punishment even before sentencing. To be labeled not respectable in a Victorian record is not simply a description. It is a mechanism by which sympathy is rationed. Christiana Edmonds, respectability as a mask, illness as an explanation. When a woman appears respectable and is accused of something transgressive, the court often reaches for two explanations: concealment or illness. In a case like Christiana Edmonds, obsession and poison bring both possibilities into play. The courtroom can treat her as deceptive and calculating, or it can treat her as unstable and driven by fixation. In practice, these readings often overlap. Medical language can be used to make moral judgment sound clinical. Respectability can be used to make obsession sound like a fall from proper womanhood rather than an ordinary human capacity for harm. The effect is another tightening of interpretation. A woman is not permitted to be complex. She must be either a mask or a patient. Either way, she is managed rather than simply heard. Amelia Dyer and the underside of respectability. Respectability does not only judge individual women. It produces markets. The shame attached to illegitimacy and poverty created the conditions in which women like Amelia Dyer could operate. The courtroom's horror at Dyer's acts is real and warranted. Yet the structure that made her trade possible sits close by: women pressured to disappear pregnancies, to surrender infants, to pay for silence, to avoid exposure. In such cases, respectability functions as a force that pushes wrongdoing into shadow and then expresses shock when shadow produces atrocity. The court punishes the visible monster and leaves the moral economy that fed her largely intact. This is a form of institutional self-protection. The system condemns what it cannot excuse and refuses to examine what it helped create. The Penge case: respectable appearances and domestic cruelty. Household cruelty is particularly destabilizing when it sits behind a respectable facade. The Penge case turns domestic detail into evidence of control and deprivation. It shows how easily cruelty can be hidden inside ordinary household arrangements when the people who live within the home have power over what outsiders are allowed to see. Respectability, in such situations, can function as a cover, a way of quieting suspicion, keeping visitors at bay, making suffering appear like illness or temperament. When the cover is removed, the court treats the household as a contamination site. And because women are expected to be the moral managers of home, women in such cases can be treated as especially culpable, not only for what they did, but for what they allowed to be done inside a space they were supposed to keep safe. What respectability reveals about treatment. Respectability is not a gentle concept in the Old Bailey record. It is a tool. It can shield a woman by making her seem less plausible for guilt. It can trap her by demanding a hidden explanation. It can condemn other women by making them seem plausible by default. It can ration sympathy and accelerate contempt. It can disguise structural cruelty and then become outraged by its outcomes. In every form, respectability shapes treatment because it shapes belief. It tells the courtroom whose story can be complex and whose must be simple. It decides whose emotions are read as sincere and whose are read as performance. It decides whether the home is treated as a sanctuary temporarily disturbed or as a site of moral failure. A respectable woman in the dock becomes a problem not only because of the charge, but because she forces the court to admit, if only for the length of a trial, that the social signs it relies upon do not reliably tell the truth. Chapter 5: The Trusted Woman and the Dangerous Access. The Victorian home runs on women's labor. Not on the labor that is praised in speeches about wives and mothers, but on the labor that happens in the margins: the woman who cleans, cooks, carries, sits up at night, keeps order, watches children, tends the sick, runs errands, manages small sums, keeps keys, and knows where things are. This work creates intimacy and familiarity. It also creates access. In the Old Bailey record, access becomes one of the most damaging facts a woman can possess. A man's opportunity to offend is often tied to the street, chance encounters, public places, drunken fights, quick theft. A woman's opportunity, especially a working woman's opportunity, is often tied to the home. The domestic sphere that Victorian ideology assigns to women becomes, in criminal narrative, the place where women are suspected of betrayal. This is where treatment becomes especially clear. Women are punished not only for acts, but for the roles the world forced them to occupy. Catherine Wilson, Care as a Pathway into Power. A nurse is employed because a household is frightened. Illness makes people vulnerable and dulls their attention. It also changes the household's hierarchy. The sick person becomes dependent. The family becomes exhausted. Someone has to take control of practical decisions: what is eaten, what is given as medicine, what is said to the doctor, what is dismissed as imagination, what is treated as danger. A nurse may not hold social power, but she holds functional power. In Catherine Wilson's case, the court treats this functional power as inherently suspicious. The sick room becomes a place where a small act can carry enormous weight. A spoonful too much. A dose given at the wrong time. A bottle opened in the dark. A paper packet folded and stored. These details are the material the court prefers because they look concrete. They allow strangers to believe in an intimate harm without having to witness it. The court also treats the nurse's proximity to money as part of the same story. When sickness sits in a home, wills and payments and promises can come close to the bedside. In court, such proximity is narrated as motive. A working woman near a wealthy or comfortable household is framed as tempted. Need becomes suspicion. Familiarity becomes opportunity. This is not simply about Wilson. It is about how the court reads a woman whose labor places her inside someone else's life. Kate Webster, the servant's access and the household's fear. Servants were expected to be invisible. They were required to know the household's routines intimately, while leaving as little trace of themselves as possible. They heard private conversations. They handled possessions. They entered bedrooms and drawers. They watched the family's habits. The household depended on that access while fearing it. Kate Webster's case sits in that tension. When the servant becomes the defendant, the court treats access as the central fact and then lets class prejudice do the rest. It is easy to believe a working-class woman was tempted by what she saw, resentful of what she served, or capable of cruelty because the era's moral imagination is prepared for that story. In these trials, the servant's access is rarely treated as a neutral condition of her employment. It is treated as an accusation in itself. The household becomes a stage where she is always potentially misusing the privileges of her work. This is another form of treatment, the conversion of necessity into guilt. A woman takes domestic work because she must. The court then treats the domestic intimacy created by that work as proof she could offend. Domestic labor as moral risk. The Victorian court is not consistent about whether women's domestic skills are virtues or dangers. A woman who manages a household well can be praised as orderly. The same competence can be reframed as calculation when she is accused. A woman's knowledge of remedies can be framed as care. The same knowledge can be reframed as capacity to poison. A woman's habit of keeping keys can be framed as responsibility. The same habit can be reframed as control. The shift is not purely logical. It depends on who the woman is, what class she belongs to, and whether her role is thought to grant her too much proximity. This is why domestic cases often feel morally charged in the record. They are not only about acts. They are about the fear that women inside the home might become agents rather than servants to its order. Adelaide Bartlett, Intimacy Without Employment, Access Without Service. Not all access is earned through paid labor. In Adelaide Bartlett's case, access is built into marriage. A wife's proximity is not suspicious in itself, it is expected. Yet when a wife is accused of harm, the very ordinariness of her access becomes the prosecution's advantage. She is near the body. She is near the food and drink. She is near private arrangements that outsiders cannot easily see. The court therefore treats the marital home as a space where the most serious offenses can be committed without public notice. The same privacy that protects respectable life also creates the possibility of hidden harm. When a respectable wife is accused, the courtroom's discomfort is evident. It must pull marriage into the open without appearing to undermine marriage as an institution. The result is often an intensified focus on domestic detail: what was given, what was said, who entered the room, what the relationship looked like from the outside, what it might have been in private. Marriage becomes a kind of evidence field. Christiana Edmonds, Access Through Ordinary Consumption. In poisoning cases, access can be indirect. Christiana Edmonds' story unsettles because it shows how domestic safety can be breached without a key. A woman can enter the home through what the household consumes: a sweet, a treat, a small gift that moves from one hand to another without suspicion. This kind of access amplifies the Victorian fear of the unseen. The home is not only vulnerable to those invited in, it is vulnerable to the ordinary world of shopping and exchange. The court responds with expert testimony and with moral storytelling, because poison needs both to feel real, science to prove it, motive to explain it. A woman accused in such a case is handled as both criminal and psychological type. The court wants to know not only what she did, but what sort of mind would do it. Obsession, jealousy, fixation, these are used to make indirect access feel personal and inevitable. Amelia Dyer, access manufactured by shame. Amelia Dyer's access to infants is not an accident. It is created. It is created by poverty and stigma, by women who need secrecy, by the lack of viable support, and by the terrible bargains women are forced to make when they cannot raise a child and cannot bear exposure. Dyer's work sits inside that hidden domestic economy. Her access is the product of other women's desperation. The court treats her as monstrous, and she was. Yet her case also exposes a grim structural truth. When society makes certain forms of motherhood impossible, it creates markets where harm can flourish. The domestic sphere is not only a private realm. It is an economic space. Access can be bought, and shame can be used as currency. Here treatment operates on two levels: the court's condemnation of one woman, and the broader system's long habit of treating women's reproductive lives as sites of moral control rather than public responsibility. The Penge case, access used as containment. Some households do not merely permit access. They weaponize it. In the Penge case, domestic access is tied to control: who is allowed to move, who is allowed to eat, who is allowed to see visitors, who is allowed to speak. The household becomes a closed system, and cruelty can be delivered through routine rather than spectacle. This is the most chilling version of domestic access, the ability to control another person's daily life and make deprivation look like illness or temperament. The court reads these details as intention: food withheld, doors locked, medical help delayed. In doing so, it exposes how power can operate inside the home without ever becoming public, until it is too late. Women in such cases are treated with a particular moral intensity because domestic management is coded as female responsibility. When that management becomes harm, the court frames it as inversion of the feminine role, a betrayal not only of a person, but of the household's moral purpose. What access does to a woman in court. Across these cases, access is both the practical condition and the moral charge. It makes the offense plausible. It makes the woman's role suspicious. It invites the court to treat domestic competence as capacity for deceit. It turns women's labor into a pathway to blame. A man can be accused of violence and still be treated as ordinary. A woman accused of betrayal from within the home is treated as a particular kind of danger, one who does not need force to enter, because she is already inside. That is the core anxiety these trials reveal. Victorian society placed women in domestic roles and then turned those roles into reasons to fear them when something went wrong. The home, which was meant to be women's proper sphere, becomes the very place where a woman can be most harshly judged for exceeding what the court believes a woman should ever be. Chapter 6: Poison, Proof, and the Authority to Speak. Poison is a crime of doubt. A bruise shows itself. A broken bone can be seen. A knife wound has a shape that sits plainly on the body. Poison hides behind symptoms that belong on the surface to ordinary illness: vomiting, weakness, confusion, pain. In a city where food and water could sicken people without any criminal hand at all, the line between misfortune and malice could be thin. This is why poisoning trials lean so heavily on authority. The court cannot rely on the public's instincts alone. It needs doctors, chemists, and the language of science to make an invisible act visible. Yet science does not arrive free of judgment. It enters a courtroom already saturated with moral expectation about women, domestic roles, and what kind of story is believable. In these cases, treatment takes a particular form: the transfer of voice away from the woman and towards those licensed to interpret her world. Catherine Wilson, The Sickroom Translated into Evidence. A nurse case invites the court to imagine a private harm carried out through ordinary care. Catherine Wilson's story, as the court frames it, depends on a chain of domestic details: who had access to food and drink, who handled the medicine bottles, who administered doses, who sat up at night, who was near the bedside drawer, who spoke about money. None of these details proves poisoning by itself. Together they build a sense of plausibility that the court can then fasten to medical testimony. This is the pivot. The domestic story becomes the scaffolding, the medical story becomes the weight-bearing structure. Once doctors begin describing symptoms and timelines, the case shifts tone. The woman's work is no longer described as care. It is described as a sequence of opportunities. The sick person's body is treated as an exhibit, and the question becomes not what the patient felt, but what those feelings must mean in expert terms. In this atmosphere, a nurse's ordinary knowledge can be reframed as sinister knowledge. Familiarity with sickness becomes familiarity with methods. Competence becomes capability. The court uses medical language to compress a lived, messy reality into a verdict-ready narrative. Christiana Edmonds, Poison as Obsession Made Physical. Where Wilson's case draws its force from intimacy inside a household, Christiana Edmonds' case draws its force from intrusion. Poisoning delivered through ordinary consumption, through items purchased, handled, gifted, creates a particular Victorian anxiety that the home's safety can be breached without breaking a window. The court responds by insisting on proof while also insisting on motive. With poison, motive does more work than usual because it makes the invisible act feel humanly possible. In Edmund's story, motive is often framed in terms of fixation. The court treats her letters, her patterns, her choices as evidence of a mind that cannot be trusted. Here, medical authority does not only interpret the body, it interprets the woman herself. Her conduct is translated into a type: obsessive, unstable, irrational, dangerous. Once a woman is handled this way, her own account is easily dismissed. Her denial becomes part of the pathology. Her insistence becomes further proof of fixation. The language of mental disturbance can serve the prosecution's need for a coherent narrative even when it is presented as neutral description. Poison becomes not only a substance but a moral diagnosis. The expert witness as a narrative anchor. Expert testimony is never merely technical in these trials. It supplies structure. A doctor's description of symptoms becomes the timeline. A chemist's test becomes the turning point. A postmortem becomes the scene the jury did not witness. This structure can be stabilizing, but it is also a form of control. Once the story is built around expert language, other kinds of truth, domestic truth, emotional truth, the slow truth of coercive life, can shrink. This matters for women because women are often nearest to illness in the Victorian imagination. They are the carers, the ones who administer remedies, the ones who report symptoms, the ones who notice changes. When an expert enters, the woman's observations are either absorbed into the medical narrative as raw material or dismissed as unreliable. The authority to speak about the body is taken from the person who lived beside it. This is treatment by translation, converting a domestic world into a professional one, and placing the defendant inside a language she did not choose. The court's hunger for certainty, and the role of character. Poisoning demands certainty, but certainty is hard to obtain. The courtroom responds by leaning on two supports: science and character. When science cannot provide perfect clarity, character often fills the gap. If the woman is seen as respectable, doubt becomes easier to tolerate. If the woman is seen as grasping or bad, doubt becomes easier to ignore. This is where poisoning cases can become particularly unjust in tone. Scientific uncertainty does not land in a vacuum. It lands on a body already judged by class, gender, and reputation. A working woman like Wilson, moving through households for pay, can be framed as inherently suspect. A woman whose desires are treated as improper can be framed as inherently dangerous. Once the court has decided what kind of woman it is looking at, the expert testimony is used to reinforce that decision rather than to challenge it. Science is presented as neutral. It is used inside a moral economy. Adelaide Bartlett, Science Inside a Respectable Story. In Adelaide Bartlett's trial, expert testimony plays a different role. Because the defendant presents as respectable, the courtroom's discomfort has to be managed. Science becomes a way to talk about a shocking allegation without appearing to indulge in mere scandal. The body becomes a site of technical explanation, substances, effects, plausibility. The court can lean on experts to keep the tone proper. Yet this does not mean the trial becomes purely clinical. It still demands motive, and motive still drifts towards the forms the era finds believable in women: concealed intimacy, moral weakness, secret vice. The experts may stabilize the evidence, but they do not erase the court's hunger for a story that protects its social assumptions. Here too, a woman's life is translated, only the translation is wrapped in polite language. The body of the victim, the body of the defendant. Poisoning trials treat bodies differently depending on whose body is being discussed. The victim's body is handled as a text, symptoms read aloud, organs described, evidence extracted. The defendant's body is handled as an instrument of interpretation. The courtroom watches her face, her composure, her tears, her calmness. It reads her demeanor as though it can reveal what chemistry cannot. This is one of the most persistent injustices of the genre. The court asks science to speak with certainty, then turns to the woman's body to supply the certainty science cannot guarantee. A calm woman can be called cold. A distressed woman can be called theatrical. A quiet woman can be called sly. A firm woman can be called brazen. The expert witness is asked to interpret substances. The public is invited to interpret the woman. The Penge case, experts and the slow violence of deprivation. The Penge case reveals another boundary of medical authority, harm that is gradual. Deprivation and neglect can be argued through domestic facts, food withheld, doors locked, isolation, and also through the body's decline. Medical witnesses can describe what a body looked like and what it suggests about starvation, illness, or mistreatment. Yet even here, experts cannot fully capture the lived reality of control inside a home, fear, humiliation, dependence, and the daily management of another person's suffering. The court uses medical testimony to make slow cruelty legible, but it still relies on domestic witnesses and domestic objects to build intention. In these cases, expertise supports the narrative, it does not replace it. Women are again central because domestic management is coded as female responsibility. The body's decline becomes evidence of a household's failure, and women are often positioned as the moral managers of that failure. Amelia Dyer, when proof is simple and the story is still managed. In Amelia Dyer's case, the court's need for moral clarity is not threatened by ambiguity. The horror is plain enough. Yet even in such a case, the courtroom still performs narrative management. It isolates blame in the figure of the monstrous woman and thereby avoids prolonged attention to the social conditions that delivered infants into her hands. Proof can be straightforward, while meaning is carefully controlled. This is another kind of authority, not over symptoms, but over interpretation. The court ensures that public horror lands where it is easiest to hold, in one person, rather than diffusing into a broader indictment of Victorian moral economy. What poisoning cases reveal about treatment? Poisoning trials show how the Old Bailey makes certainty out of what is hard to see. They show how domestic life is translated into evidence. They show how experts are used to stabilize narrative. They show how character fills the gap science cannot close. They show how women's voices shrink beneath professional authority. They show how a woman's demeanor is used as a substitute for proof. Above all, they show the Victorian court struggle with women who hold domestic access. When a woman is close to bodies, close to food, close to medicine, close to letters and drawers and keys, the court treats that closeness as both the mechanism of harm and the reason to fear her. The trusted woman becomes the dangerous woman, and the courtroom enlists science to make the transformation feel inevitable. Chapter 7, The Woman as Motive. The Old Bailey wants a reason. Not because motive is required for guilt in every case, but because motive is required for satisfaction. A jury is made of people, not instruments. People want to know why. They want a story that feels humanly believable, and the Victorian courtroom is especially hungry for stories that restore moral order after it has been disturbed. When women are on trial, the court tends to prefer a narrow range of reasons. Jealousy, greed, obsession, spite, vanity, improper desire. These motives are culturally convenient. They keep the explanation inside the woman rather than in the conditions around her. They fit Victorian assumptions about feminine weakness and domestic competition. They allow the court to treat a case as an individual moral failure rather than a reflection of poverty, dependence, coercion, or social shame. This is one of the clearest forms of treatment in the record, the repeated compression of women's lives into motives that feel familiar to the court. Catherine Wilson, money as an explanation that does not disturb the home. In a case like Catherine Wilson's, motive is almost always pulled towards money. Money is clean on paper. It is easier to talk about than intimacy. It does not force the court to examine the emotional economy of care, exhaustion, resentment, exploitation, fear of dismissal, the constant negotiation of a working woman's security. Money gives the courtroom a straight line. A nurse is paid. A nurse may be promised more. A nurse may see valuables. A nurse may hear talk of wills. Once those facts are mentioned, the court can build a motive that sounds self-evident. She wanted to benefit. She wanted to take. She was tempted. She arranged the outcome. This explanation does important cultural work. It turns the case into a story about one woman's greed rather than a story about the vulnerability of the sickroom and the dependence of the working poor. It keeps the respectable household intact in moral terms. The household is not indicted, the outsider woman is. Money motive, in these cases, is not only plausible. It is convenient. Adelaide Bartlett, improper intimacy as a court-approved narrative. With Adelaide Bartlett, motive is pulled into the private sphere in a different way. A respectable woman accused of serious wrongdoing threatens the court's reliance on surface signs. The courtroom's response is often to search for a hidden disruption inside the marriage, a relationship gone wrong, a secret arrangement, an emotional entanglement that can be framed as moral failure. Sexual implication becomes an explanatory device. It offers heat without needing to state everything directly. The court uses this kind of motive because it supports a familiar lesson: domestic order breaks when women deviate from proper feminine conduct. The trial becomes a warning about private vice, and the woman's respectability becomes a mask rather than a protection. This is a particular kind of handling. The court cannot simply say she is greedy or rough. It must build a motive that preserves her class position while still making her criminality believable. Improper intimacy does that work. It allows condemnation without directly condemning the social class she represents. Kate Webster, resentment and the readiness to believe. For a servant, motive is often supplied before the evidence is finished. The Victorian court expects certain things from working-class women: that they are tempted by what they serve, that they are restless, that they are morally loose, that they are driven by appetite and anger rather than restraint. These expectations make resentment an easy motive. In Kate Webster's kind of case, the home becomes a provocation. It is the visible reminder of what the servant does not have. The prosecution does not need to prove resentment as a psychological reality. It only needs to gesture at the servant's station and the household's comfort. The jury is invited to fill in the feeling. This is where treatment becomes almost invisible because it masquerades as common sense. The court pretends it is reasoning from facts, when it is often reasoning from class imagination. Mary Piercy, jealousy as a narrative shortcut. Jealousy is the courtroom's favorite explanation for sensational women. It is vivid. It is familiar. It turns women into rivals and men into prizes. It fits Victorian storytelling about feminine desire as dangerous when it strays outside marriage. It also supplies a motive that feels both personal and moral: she wanted what she should not want. In Mary Piercy's case, jealousy functions as a shortcut that reduces complexity. It invites the jury to believe they already understand her. Once jealousy is installed as motive, the court can treat domestic details as confirmation: a meeting, a letter, a quarrel, a glimpse, an overheard remark. Jealousy is particularly useful because it does not require the court to examine structural dependence: how women's security could be tied to men, how reputations could be destroyed, how survival might demand compromises. It presents the case as passion, not economics; emotion, not constraint. The woman becomes motive itself, a bundle of desire that naturally leads to harm. Christiana Edmonds, obsession turned into destiny. Obsession is motive with a medical flavor. In Christiana Edmonds' story, the court can frame the alleged wrongdoing as the product of a mind that cannot let go. Fixation becomes a kind of destiny. Letters, habits, and patterns of behaviour are used to make the act feel inevitable. The case becomes not only about what happened, but about who she must be in order for it to have happened. This is a powerful form of narrative control. Once obsession is accepted, the defendant's denial can be treated as further proof of self-deception, proof of instability, proof that she does not understand herself. A woman is cornered by a motive that consumes her personhood. Here the Old Bailey's handling of motive blends into its handling of mental disorder. The court does not always need an explicit insanity defense to treat a woman's mind as the explanation. It can medicalize motive without calling it medicine. Amelia Dyer, wickedness as the simplest motive. Some cases are so horrifying that the court abandons subtlety. With Amelia Dyer, motive is often reduced to a blunt moral conclusion: cruelty, greed, depravity. The woman is treated as a monster, and monstrousness itself becomes the reason. This satisfies public need. It also does something else: it keeps the world tidy. If one woman is uniquely wicked, then the structures that delivered vulnerable infants into her care can remain less examined. If the motive is simple evil, then shame, poverty, and coercive moral regulation can stay in the background. A woman can carry the full meaning of the case, and society can keep its self-image. This is not to soften Dyer's crimes. It is to note what the courtroom does with them. It uses her as a vessel for horror in a way that protects the broader narrative. The Penge case, motive as household logic. In the Penge case, motive is argued through daily control. It is not one dramatic passion. It is a slow logic, keeping someone weak, keeping someone dependent, keeping control over money, movement, and attention. The motive becomes inseparable from household management. Ordinary decisions, who eats, who visits, who gets medical care, are presented as part of a deliberate pattern. This kind of motive is harder for the courtroom to present as romantic drama, so it often returns to moral language, coldness, calculation, unnaturalness. Women are again central because domestic management is coded as female responsibility. If a woman appears to be organizing the household's cruelty, the court treats it as the deepest betrayal of her gendered role. The motive is built from the home itself, as though the home has a mind and the defendants are its instruments. Why motive matters for women's treatment. Motive is where the court's cultural assumptions are most visible, because motive is partly story. When evidence is uncertain, motive stabilizes belief. When a woman's role creates discomfort, motive supplies reassurance. When domestic life is messy, motive offers a clean line. When the public wants a lesson, motive delivers it. Across these 7 cases, the Old Bailey repeatedly chooses explanations that keep women readable in familiar forms: the greedy carer, the improper wife, the resentful servant, the jealous rival, the obsessed poisoner, the monstrous baby farmer, the household manager of cruelty. These motives are not always false. They are, however, often incomplete. They narrow the meaning of what happened by insisting that the reason lies inside the woman rather than in the conditions that shaped her options. That narrowing is a kind of treatment in itself. It is the moment the court stops asking what a woman endured and starts deciding what a woman is. Chapter 8. The Woman as Mind. When the Old Bailey cannot comfortably explain a woman, it reaches for her mind. This does not always appear as a formal insanity defense. Often it is quieter. A witness says she was odd. Someone mentions nerves. A doctor speaks of delusion, melancholy, excitability, hysteria, unsoundness. A woman's behavior is described as unstable, irrational, excessive. Her feelings become symptoms. Her insistence becomes fixation. Her refusal becomes derangement. In Victorian justice, the mind is not only medical territory. It is moral territory. To call a woman unstable is to reshape how the court hears her. It is to move her from the category of ordinary human motive into the category of managed risk. This is one of the book's central threads, because it shows how treatment can look like mercy and still function like removal. Medicine as a second court. Medical authority does not simply assist the law. It can overtake it. Doctors are asked to speak about responsibility, whether a woman understood what she was doing, whether she knew right from wrong, whether she could control herself. These are legal questions disguised as clinical ones. They invite the doctor to perform certainty about inner life. The courtroom welcomes that performance because it offers resolution. It allows the jury to feel it is not merely judging, but diagnosing. Yet the diagnosis is never free of cultural assumptions. Victorian medicine is steeped in ideas about women as inherently governed by nerves, reproduction, emotion, and instability. Those ideas do not remain outside the court. They move through it. The result is that a woman's mind becomes a site the court can occupy. It is interpreted by others and then used to determine her fate. Christiana Edmonds, Obsession as Pathology, Pathology as Explanation. In Christiana Edmonds' case, the court's handling of mind is inseparable from its handling of motive. Obsession is not treated as a complex human experience. It is treated as a fault that consumes her. The case invites the court to speak about her as a type, a woman driven by fixation, incapable of restraint, ruled by inner disorder. This has 2 effects. First, it makes the alleged act feel inevitable. The court does not have to grapple with ambiguity as much if it believes her mind naturally leads to harm. Second, it strips her of voice. Once obsession becomes pathology, her denial can be interpreted as part of the same disorder, an extension of self-deception rather than a competing account. The court is not only deciding whether she poisoned. It is deciding what kind of woman she is, one whose desires are not merely improper but pathological. Adelaide Bartlett, Respectability, then the Hunt for Instability. A respectable woman does not sit easily in a narrative of madness. Yet the court still searches for something beneath the surface. With Adelaide Bartlett, Mind can appear in subtler forms, suggestions of hidden emotion, abnormality, secrets, peculiar arrangements. The courtroom may not call it insanity, but it may still treat the defendant as someone whose inner life must be interrogated in order for the story to cohere. This is a particular Victorian move. When a respectable woman is accused, the court often prefers to treat her as an exception rather than as an ordinary woman capable of wrongdoing. Exception can be framed as illness, weakness, unusual passion, moral defect, anything that preserves the ideal of the respectable home while explaining why it produced a defendant. The woman is handled like a surface that cannot be trusted to reflect the truth of her interior. Catherine Wilson, calculation mistaken for coldness. Not every woman is medicalized in the same way. A working woman like Catherine Wilson is less likely to be granted the soft language of nerves. Her competence is more readily framed as calculation, her calmness as hardness. Where a middle-class woman's distress might be translated into fragility, a nurse's composure may be translated into cold intent. Even so, the courtroom still treats Wilson's mind as the place where the answer must be found. The court watches for signs of feeling and decides what those signs mean. It reads her manner as though it can reveal whether she is the kind of woman who could betray a sickroom. The mind is not only discussed through doctors. It is discussed through demeanor, through the moral reading of a face. This is treatment by surveillance, the court's insistence that it can see into a woman and locate guilt there. Kate Webster, Class Pathology and the Unreasonable Woman. Working-class women are often framed as unstable in a different register. Their anger is treated as temper rather than terror. Their refusal is treated as insolence rather than self-protection. Their distress is treated as hysteria rather than fear. The language may not sound medical, but it performs the same function. It places a woman's behavior outside reason and makes her easier to condemn. In cases like Kate Webster's, the court can treat a woman's personality as proof of her capacity for wrongdoing. Her boldness becomes evidence. Her speech becomes evidence. Her lack of deference becomes evidence. The courtroom calls this character assessment, but it operates like a social diagnosis. The woman is not properly governable. This is the mind handled through class prejudice, less clinical, equally controlling. Mary Piercy, Mind as Monstrosity. In sensational cases, the court can treat a woman's mind as simply bad. Mary Piercy's public image invites the notion that her interior is not disordered but depraved. The courtroom and the culture around it make a different kind of psychological claim, not that she is ill, but that she is unnatural. Her calm becomes chilling. Her tears become performance. Her denial becomes cunning. The mind is interpreted, again and again, through a moral lens. This is another Victorian habit. When a woman's act is sensational enough, the court does not need medicine to explain her. It can explain her through the concept of the unnatural woman, which functions as its own diagnosis. The outcome is similar. Her inner life is seized and narrated by others. Amelia Dyer, The Refusal of Complexity. Some cases are treated as beyond psychology. With Amelia Dyer, the horror invites a refusal of nuance. Her actions are framed as wickedness so extreme that explanation feels like contamination. The court does not want to understand her, it wants to isolate her. Yet even here, the handling of mind is present in what the court refuses to allow. It refuses to connect the defendant's choices to broader pressures except as background. It refuses to treat the social conditions that delivered infants to her care as psychologically consequential. It refuses the possibility that an entire moral economy produced the circumstances in which her crimes could flourish. The mind becomes irrelevant only because the court has decided the only safe meaning is monstrosity. The Penge case, mind distributed across a household. The Penge case complicates the question of mind by spreading responsibility. Where cruelty is gradual and domestic, the court struggles with intention. It must decide whether a pattern is deliberate, and if so, whose mind organized it. In doing so, it treats the household as a kind of collective machine. Motive and intention are argued through routine, food withheld, doors locked, isolation maintained. Women in these narratives can be positioned as household managers, and therefore as the minds behind the management. This reflects a cultural expectation that women run the domestic sphere. When the domestic sphere becomes a site of harm, the court can treat a woman as the organizer even where her actual power may have been constrained by men, finances, and social pressure. Here again, mind is not simply medical. It is a way of assigning moral leadership. Mercy that removes. When the court accepts a mental explanation for a woman's behavior, it often changes the question. Instead of what does she deserve, the question becomes what should be done with her. The language shifts towards safety. The woman is treated as someone who must be managed. This can look merciful because it may spare a woman a punishment framed as moral destruction. It can also be a pathway to disappearance, a life taken out of public view under the name of treatment. The Old Bailey record does not always follow what happens after such decisions. It often stops at the legal pivot. The woman's continued existence is reduced to an administrative outcome. The public story ends neatly. The managed life does not. What these cases reveal about treatment. Across these 7 women, the court repeatedly reaches for the same move when it encounters discomfort. It locates the problem in the woman's interior. Sometimes that interior is framed as illness. Sometimes it is framed as cold calculation. Sometimes it is framed as temper or insolence. Sometimes it is framed as unnatural depravity. Sometimes it is framed as a household mind organizing cruelty. Each framing determines not only how a jury feels, but what the court imagines is appropriate to do with her. A Victorian woman could be condemned as wicked, excused as ill, or reduced to an ungovernable type. In every version, the result is a form of handling that takes her story from her and places it into the language of other authorities. The court does not only punish bodies. It classifies minds. Chapter 9, The Body in the Dock. The Old Bailey claims to judge actions. It also judges bodies. A Victorian trial is full of looking. The courtroom looks at injuries, at objects, at documents, at witnesses. It also looks at the defendant, and not in the same way it looks at a man. A woman's body is treated as a surface that should reveal the truth, whether she is respectable, whether she is hardened, whether she is ashamed, whether she is lying, whether she is mad. This is not always spoken as prejudice. It is spoken as observation. That is what makes it effective. The court's treatment of women often arrives through ordinary words that carry extraordinary assumptions. She appeared calm, she seemed agitated, she was bold, she was quiet, she did not show much emotion, she wept. The woman is turned into a kind of exhibit, and her demeanor becomes a form of evidence that can never be properly tested. The body becomes part of the prosecution and part of the punishment. The victim's body, the defendant's body. In many of the book's cases, the victim's body is described with clinical certainty. A surgeon speaks of wounds, bruising, swelling, the depth of a cut, the state of organs, signs of poisoning, the evidence of starvation. The language sounds clean. It appears to remove emotion from the account. It offers the jury something solid in a case that might otherwise be built on inference. The defendant's body is treated differently. It is moralist. Her appearance becomes a clue. Her clothing becomes a statement. Her posture becomes attitude. Her voice becomes credibility. The courtroom reads the woman's body for the meaning of her act, even though bodies are famously unreliable narrators. A frightened woman may look calm. A traumatized woman may look hard. A defiant woman may be defending her dignity. A calm woman may simply be exhausted. The court treats these possibilities as less important than its hunger for a readable figure. Catherine Wilson, The Calm Nurse and the Suspicion of Composure. A nurse is expected to be calm. The sick room trains calm into the body. In Catherine Wilson's case, that expectation becomes dangerous to her. A woman who has sat through illness and death can appear steady in a way that others find unnerving. In court, steadiness can be interpreted as hardness. A professional manner can be interpreted as calculation. Experience can be interpreted as immunity to feeling. This is one of the most persistent traps the record lays for working women in caring roles. The qualities that make them employable, composure, practicality, efficiency, can be turned into moral evidence against them. The court reads the nurse's body and decides it is seeing not competence but cold intent. The body in the dock is judged against the court's idea of how a guilty woman should look. Adelaide Bartlett, Delicacy, Dignity, and the Performance of the Proper Woman. A respectable woman is expected to be controlled. In Adelaide Bartlett's trial, control can be interpreted as dignity or as concealment. A woman who holds herself carefully can be praised as ladylike or suspected as guarded. A woman who does not collapse into visible shame can be treated as admirable or unnatural. This is another double bind. The respectable woman must appear properly feminine, but not so composed that she appears unfeeling. She must appear sincere, but not theatrical. She must be presentable, but not so presentable that the court begins to suspect she is managing the room. The body becomes a battleground where femininity is assessed, and that assessment quietly influences belief. Kate Webster, Classed Bodies and the Readiness to Despise. Working-class women's bodies are read with less generosity. Their speech is treated as evidence of roughness. Their clothes are treated as evidence of disorder. Their anger is treated as temperament rather than fear. Their refusal to show deference is treated as insolence. The court's gaze carries class with it. In a case like Kate Webster's, the defendant's body is not simply observed, it is measured against a standard that was never meant for her. If she is loud, she is vulgar. If she is quiet, she is sullen. If she is emotional, she is hysterical. If she is calm, she is hard. The contempt can sit in small descriptions and still do enormous work. A jury is invited to see the kind of person she is, and once they believe they can see, they feel less need to doubt. Mary Piercy, The Spectacle Body. Some women are looked at as entertainment. Mary Piercy's case sits in a culture that consumes sensational women. In such cases, the defendant's body becomes part of the public story in advance. The woman's face, her clothing, her manner, the question of whether she looks like a murderess. This is where the gaze becomes particularly cruel. The courtroom becomes a place where a woman's humanity is debated through her ability to satisfy a stereotype. Does she look wicked? Does she look cold? Does she look too pretty, too plain, too ordinary? Each answer can be used against her because the point is not truth. The point is legibility. A sensational defendant is treated as a text the crowd believes it can read. Christiana Edmonds, The Body as Symptom. Where a woman's alleged offense is tied to obsession and poison, her body is treated as a symptom of her mind. Her expressions, her agitation, her calm, her insistence, everything is available for interpretation as instability. The court is not satisfied with proving a sequence of acts. It wants to prove a kind of woman. It wants to make the motive visible on her face. In these cases, the courtroom gaze merges with medical gaze. The woman becomes a patient even as she is prosecuted. Her body is read as evidence of disorder, and disorder becomes a way to make her story feel inevitable. Amelia Dyer, The Body Denied Sympathy. There are defendants the court refuses to see as humanly complex. With Amelia Dyer, the scale of harm creates a social demand for absolute condemnation. The defendant's body becomes the vessel for horror rather than the subject of interpretation. Sympathy is withheld by design. The court does not want to read her as a person who could be understood. It wants to read her as a boundary marker, the kind of woman who is outside the moral world. Even here, the gaze is doing work. It is teaching the public where to place disgust and where to stop thinking. The Penge case, Bodies that show slow violence. The Penge case reminds the reader that not all harm is dramatic. Some harm accumulates. A body deprived of food, attention, movement, and care changes slowly. The court turns those changes into evidence. Medical witnesses describe decline, domestic witnesses describe control. The body becomes the point where private cruelty finally leaves visible trace. Women in such cases are often assessed not only for what they did, but for what they failed to do. Why did she not feed? Why did she not help? Why did she not call a doctor? Why did she not intervene? The body of the victim becomes an accusation against the household, and the court's gaze falls heavily on women because women are expected to be caretakers. The victim's body becomes the indictment of the domestic order itself. The violence of reading bodies. The courtroom's reading of bodies is not harmless. It shapes outcomes. It determines who is believed. It determines who is pitied. It determines whose calm is dignity and whose calm is guilt. It determines whose tears are sincere and whose tears are theater. This is why the Old Bailey record can feel so modern in its discomfort. A woman is still asked to perform credibility in her body. She is still punished for the wrong kind of emotion. She is still treated as readable in ways that are never applied evenly to men. Victorian justice leaves many clues about itself. One of the clearest is the way it looks at women, then claims what it sees is evidence. Chapter 10, The Sentence as Story. The verdict is not the end of judgment. It is the point where judgment becomes permanent. A Victorian sentence does more than determine what will happen to a body. It determines what the public is meant to believe the case meant. The punishment is not only a response. It is a statement. It announces what sort of woman the defendant has been decided to be, and what society intends to do with that kind of woman. The Old Bailey record preserves the verdict and the sentence in a small space on the page. The moral weight behind them is much larger. Punishment and the need for a moral ending. A criminal court cannot admit uncertainty for long. It can hesitate during testimony. It can express doubt through questions and objections. But it must end with a formal decision, and that decision has to feel final enough to satisfy the public idea of justice. For women, the public idea of justice often includes an additional demand, that femininity be restored to order. The punishment is expected to do cultural repair. It is meant to correct, to deter, to warn, to shame, to remove. This is why sentencing language often feels like storytelling. It gives the case a moral conclusion and invites the public to accept the conclusion as natural. Catherine Wilson, The Betrayal That Demands Removal. A poisoning allegation attached to a nurse is treated as a particular kind of danger. The nurse is the woman who is invited into private vulnerability. If she is framed as having betrayed that invitation, the court treats her not simply as a criminal but as a contaminant of trust. The sentence, in such a case, carries symbolic weight. It reassures the public that the sickroom can be made safe again by removing the woman who broke its rules. In this narrative, punishment is presented as restoration. The household can return to believing in care because the betrayer has been identified and expelled. The record's economy of words at this point can be misleading. A sentence looks like a tidy line of text. The lived outcome is rarely tidy. Custody expands. A life shrinks. The meaning becomes fixed. Adelaide Bartlett, When the Court Cannot Safely Punish the Lady. Respectability complicates not only the trial but the sentencing atmosphere. When a woman like Adelaide Bartlett stands accused, the courtroom's actions are watched not just for fairness but for what they imply about class and domestic order. A harsh punishment of a respectable woman can feel to the public like a breach of the social promise that respectability protects. A lenient outcome can feel like proof that the system favors the comfortable. Either way, the sentence becomes political in the small sense. It signals who the law is for. In such cases, the court's language is often careful. It wraps judgment in procedural correctness. The result, whatever it is, must look like the law speaking, not class speaking. That performance can shape what is said and what is left unsaid. A woman may escape punishment and still not escape judgment. The sentence is not only carceral. It can be reputational. It can be the lasting story that the trial has installed. Kate Webster, The Servant as example. Where a working-class woman is convicted of a serious offense, the sentence is often made to do demonstrative work. The servant is treated as someone whose proximity to respectable life is dangerous when not governed by fear. Punishment becomes a message not only to the individual but to other women of her class. Stay in your place, accept your role, do not confuse access with entitlement. This is where class and gender merge into a single moral instruction. A servant's sentence can be framed as protection of the household itself. The court does not have to say this overtly. The severity, the tone, and the public retelling often do it for the court. Mary Piercy, The Public Appetite for Closure. In sensational cases, punishment is expected to satisfy the crowd. The trial has already been consumed as story. The woman has already been shaped into a type. The public wants the story to end in the only way that feels appropriate to that type, with a punishment large enough to match the moral image. This is the point where the courtroom becomes most exposed to cultural pressure. A jury's decision is not made in a vacuum. It is made in a city that reads and talks and repeats and builds expectation. When punishment arrives, it is treated as confirmation that the public was right to feel what it felt. For the defendant, this means the sentence is not only the state acting. It is the state acting in harmony with the crowd's judgment of who she is. Christiana Edmonds, When Punishment is Reframed as Management. Where a woman's mind is central to the narrative, punishment can shift in form. Instead of being framed as desert, it is framed as safety. The language becomes about danger, stability, control. In these cases, treatment can become a legal outcome. The woman is removed into institutions described as medical rather than penal. This removal is presented as less brutal than prison. It can also be less finite. It moves decision-making away from the open courtroom and into administrative processes. The public story ends neatly. The woman's managed life continues in quiet. This is one of the great Victorian ambiguities: mercy that confines, compassion that disappears. Amelia Dyer, punishment as moral purification. Some crimes produce a desire not only to punish but to cleanse. With Amelia Dyer, the horror invites a punishment that functions as purification: remove the monster, restore moral order, close the wound with finality. The sentence is demanded as proof that society has rejected what she represents. Yet this purification is selective. The court can purge one woman while leaving untouched the structures that delivered victims into her hands. The punishment satisfies the need for a clear ending. It does not necessarily satisfy the need for truth about the wider world. The story closes where the system finds it safest to close. The Penge case, sentencing a household. Where cruelty is collective, the court must still deliver individual outcomes. The Penge case turns household life into a ledger of responsibility. The sentence becomes the court's decision about who carried the moral center of the cruelty. Women can be treated as especially culpable when the cruelty is framed as domestic management, because the court expects women to be the moral organizers of home. Sentencing in such cases does not only punish acts. It assigns meaning. It declares who was the organizer, who was the follower, who was the corrupter, who was the weak instrument. The household is reduced to roles, and the sentence fixes those roles into official memory. The quiet punishments that do not appear in the sentence line. The formal sentence is only part of what is done to women. There is the punishment of exposure, private life retold publicly, reputation shredded, intimate detail turned into entertainment. There is the punishment of disbelief, fear minimized, coercion relabeled as quarrel, survival interpreted as vice. There is the punishment of translation, a woman's story replaced with motive, diagnosis, or stereotype. There is the punishment of disappearance, removal into custody where the record stops following. These punishments can outlast the formal term. They shape a woman's future whether she walks free or not. What sentencing reveals about treatment? Sentencing reveals what the court thought it was doing. Was it restoring domestic trust? Was it protecting respectable life? Was it disciplining servants and the poor? Was it satisfying public appetite for punishment? Was it managing a woman as risk rather than judging her as agent? Was it purging a monster and closing the story safely? Was it assigning moral leadership inside a cruel household? The Old Bailey speaks through its outcomes, but it also speaks through the shape of the ending it prefers. The sentence is never only a number of years or a final penalty. It is the last act in a narrative that has been narrowing a woman from the first moment her life entered the machine. The court ends the story. The record preserves the ending. The woman lives, or disappears, beneath it. Chapter 11, What the Court Would Not Hear. A Victorian trial is full of speech. It is also full of silences. Some silences are procedural. The court only hears what is admissible. Some are practical. A witness forgets, a defendant cannot explain herself, an ordinary life does not translate neatly under oath. But many silences are cultural. They are the things Victorian justice did not have language for, or did not want language for, because naming them would disturb the stories the court relied upon. Those silences shaped women's treatment as much as the spoken evidence did. They determined which experiences counted as context and which were treated as irrelevant. They determined what could be imagined as coercion and what was dismissed as a quarrel. They determined whose pain was legible and whose pain was treated as weakness, vice, or performance. The record preserves what was said. It also shows what could not be said without being disbelieved. The silence around domestic violence as condition. Domestic violence appears in the archive most often as an incident. A blow. A threat. A row. A commotion that spilled into public view. What the court struggles to hold as violence as a condition, the slow training of fear, the routine of intimidation, the calculation required to survive, the economic traps, the risk that leaving will make things worse. This silence matters even in cases that are not formally domestic violence cases. It matters for Catherine Wilson, because working women in domestic roles were often vulnerable to exploitation that never appears in the record as coercion. It matters for Adelaide Bartlett, because a marriage can contain control and private pressure that a respectable surface hides. It matters for Mary Piercy, because sensational narratives prefer jealousy to the more complex realities of dependence and reputation. It matters for the Penge case, because household cruelty can be normalized within a family long before the law interrupts it. The court prefers a single event because it can be proved. A condition requires listening differently, and listening differently would require the court to admit that the home can be structured by harm without ever producing the sort of evidence the law loves. The silence around women's economic constraint. Victorian women were governed by economics in ways the courtroom often treats as background. A servant's wages, a nurse's employment, a wife's legal dependence, a woman's lack of independent income, a single mother's desperation, these are conditions that can shape choices. Yet in court they are often moralist rather than understood. A woman seeks money and is called grasping. A woman fears poverty and is called calculating. A woman stays because she has nowhere to go and is called weak. A woman leaves and is called disorderly. The law can account for theft, fraud, and financial motive. It is less comfortable accounting for poverty as pressure. The courtroom prefers to place the reason inside the woman's character rather than inside the structure of her options. This silence helps explain why class judgment feels so pervasive in cases like Kate Webster's. The court's language makes economic vulnerability look like moral failure. The silence around shame and reproductive reality. Certain forms of shame drove women into secrecy, and secrecy made them vulnerable. Amelia Dyer's case sits at the darkest edge of that truth. The court can condemn her actions without naming the social forces that enabled her trade, stigma around illegitimacy, the lack of support from others, and the desperation produced by moral regulation. When those forces remain unnamed, the case becomes easier to isolate as monstrosity rather than to confront as a symptom of a wider world. This silence is protective. It protects the moral order by keeping its costs off the record. The silence around coercion in respectable lives. Respectable lives are not necessarily safe lives. The record often treats them as though they are. In Adelaide Bartlett's story, the court pulls marriage apart for motive, yet it may still struggle to speak directly about power inside that marriage in terms that resemble coercion. Victorian language tends to moralize intimacy rather than analyze it. A woman is suspected of improper desire more readily than she is recognized as living under pressure. The court can speak endlessly about virtue and vice. It has fewer tools for describing what control looks like when it is socially sanctioned. This silence gives respectability its power. It hides certain kinds of harm by refusing to name them. The silence around mental suffering that is not madness. Victorian courts could recognize madness. They struggled to recognize trauma. They could accept delusion, mania, and unsoundness. They were less able to accept that a woman might be shaped by fear, grief, exhaustion, or prolonged humiliation in ways that produced actions that were neither rational calculation nor simple insanity. This matters for Christiana Edmonds, where obsession can be medicalized into destiny. It matters for women in sensational cases like Mary Piercy's, where complexity is replaced by the unnatural woman narrative. It matters for domestic cruelty like the Penge case, where suffering can be treated as temperament until a body collapses. The court prefers either moral agency, she chose wickedness, or medical defect, she was ill. The space between, where human beings often live, is harder for the record to hold. The silence around women's anger. Anger is one of the least permitted female emotions in the Victorian courtroom. A woman's anger is easily reframed as temper, hysteria, insolence, spite. It becomes a character flaw rather than a response. Even when anger is justified, the court can treat it as evidence the woman is ungovernable. This is why the record so often punishes women in tone. The woman who insists, who argues, who refuses to accept a story written for her, is treated as suspect because she violates the expectation that a good woman is compliant even in her own defense. The silence here is not the absence of anger. It is the absence of permission for anger to mean what it often means, a response to violation. The silence that follows the verdict. One of the deepest silences in the archive is what happens after court. A sentence is recorded. A life goes on. The record rarely follows it. Women vanish into prisons, institutions, workhouses, new lodgings, new names, social ruin, or simply time. Some return to the very conditions that brought them to court. Some do not return at all. This disappearance is itself a form of treatment. The system does not need to track what it has done. It needs only to decide and to move on. The public story ends. The human story continues without official witness. What the silences tell the reader. The Old Bailey record is valuable not because it tells everything, but because it reveals what Victorian justice was able to imagine. It could imagine women as greedy. It could imagine women as jealous. It could imagine women as obsessed. It could imagine women as unnatural monsters. It could imagine women as household organizers of cruelty. It could imagine women as ill and therefore manageable. It struggled to imagine women as constrained, coerced, traumatized, economically trapped, or driven by shame under conditions the culture itself created. It struggled to treat the home as a site of structural harm rather than occasional misfortune. These limits shaped outcomes. They shaped language. They shaped the public meaning of each case. To read these trials closely is therefore to read not only what happened, but what the court was willing to hear, and what it was willing to leave behind the door, unheard, because hearing it would have required the system to tell a different story about itself. Chapter 12. The Old Bailey's Women. By the time the record closes, each woman has been narrowed. Not only by the charge and the evidence, but by the court's need to make her legible. The Old Bailey is not satisfied with facts alone. It wants meanings that can travel, a warning, a lesson, a restoration of order. The woman becomes the vessel for that meaning, and the record preserves her in that form long after the courtroom has emptied. This book follows 7 women because their cases show the process with unusual clarity. They do not represent all women in Victorian criminal justice. They do, however, reveal the habits the system repeated, habits that shaped thousands of lesser-known defendants whose names sit quietly in the archive. What remains, when the cases are read together, is not a single conclusion about Victorian women. It is a portrait of Victorian judgment. Catherine Wilson, trust turned into threat. Wilson's case shows how quickly a working woman's labor can be turned against her. She is brought into homes to care. That care requires access. Access becomes suspicion. Suspicion turns competence into capability, calm into coldness, proximity into motive. The court's handling of her is saturated with a fear that sits beneath the facts, fear of the woman who is inside the home but not of it. Her treatment is the translation of her work into betrayal. The record makes her legible as the dangerous nurse, and that legibility does cultural work beyond the verdict. Adelaide Bartlett, the respectable woman and the exposure of privacy. Bartlett's case shows that respectability is not a shield so much as a different kind of vulnerability. A respectable woman in the dock unsettles the court. It cannot rely on its usual assumptions, so it audits her. It dissects marriage, friendship, domestic arrangement, hints of impropriety, anything that might supply plausibility. Even where the outcome spares her legally, the process exposes her to a deep form of public violation. Her life becomes a legitimate subject of inquiry. Her treatment is the stripping of respectable privacy and the insistence that a lady must be explained. Kate Webster, the servant as plausible culprit. Webster's case shows how class becomes evidence without being called evidence. A servant's access is treated as temptation. Her station is treated as moral texture. The household's respectability becomes a measuring stick that she is expected to fail. Where a comfortable woman may be granted complexity, the servant is often granted only motive in its ugliest shorthand: resentment, appetite, coarseness, lack of restraint. Her treatment is the readiness with which the court imagines her guilty, and the way her body, speech, and status become part of the proof. Mary Piercy, when the court participates in spectacle. Piercy's case shows how quickly a woman can be turned into a public monster. Sensational defendants are not tried only in court. They are tried in the public imagination, and the courtroom becomes one of the institutions that helps fix the stereotype. The record lingers on demeanor, on appearance, on the moral reading of a woman's face. Motive is offered in culturally satisfying forms. Doubt becomes harder to tolerate. Her treatment is the reduction of a woman into a type that can be consumed and punished, with a sense of certainty that is as much emotional as evidentiary. Christiana Edmonds, the woman made into a mind. Edmonds' story shows the Old Bailey's readiness to handle female transgression through pathology. Obsession becomes motive. Motive becomes diagnosis. Diagnosis becomes a way to replace her voice with other authority. Once the court treats a woman as unstable, everything she says can be processed through that assumption. Her treatment is the medical takeover of meaning, the shifting of her from person to case, from defendant to managed risk. Amelia Dyer, the monster that protects the system. Dyer's case shows how the court uses monstrosity to keep the wider world clean. Her crimes were real, and horror is the appropriate response. Yet the courtroom's handling also isolates her as the singular vessel of evil, allowing the structures that made her trade possible, poverty, shame, the policing of women's sexuality and motherhood, to remain background. The sentence becomes purification. The story ends safely in one person. Her treatment is being made into a boundary marker so society can stop looking further. The Penge case, the household put on trial. The Penge case shows how the court tries slow cruelty by turning domestic life into a ledger. Food, keys, rooms, visits, medical care, each detail becomes evidence of intention. The court searches for moral leadership inside the household and often places women at its center because women are expected to be the managers of domestic life. Where harm is collective, the court still demands a central figure who carries meaning. The treatment here is symbolic. Women are judged not only for acts but for the betrayal of the domestic role itself. What is consistent across all 7? The cases differ in status, offense, and public attention. The courtroom habits repeat. Women are judged through their roles. Domestic space is turned into public evidence. Character is used to fill gaps. Motive is narrowed into culturally familiar scripts. Experts are used to stabilize stories and to displace women's voices. The defendant's body is read as evidence. Sentencing functions as a moral ending. What cannot be named is pushed into silence. This is why the Old Bailey record matters. It does not only tell what happened. It shows how Victorian justice decided what women were allowed to mean, what the record leaves behind, and what it still gives. The archive cannot restore interior life. It cannot reliably preserve fear, shame, coercion, exhaustion, or the daily compromises that shaped choices. It does not always follow women after court. It does not give equal weight to every voice. Yet it gives something rare, the public language of judgment in action. It shows, line by line, how a society processed women when domestic life broke into crime and when crime broke back into domestic life. It shows how the state handled the most intimate spheres, illness, marriage, service, motherhood, household control, by converting them into legal story. The Old Bailey record endures because it preserves not only crime, but the culture of deciding. A woman walks into the court as a person. She leaves the record as a meaning. Epilogue. After the record. The Old Bailey gives endings. Life rarely does. A trial concludes with a verdict and a sentence, and the printed record preserves that conclusion as though it is the final truth of a person. The page closes. The court moves on. The city keeps breathing. The woman, whether acquitted, convicted, confined, or released, continues into a world altered by what has been said about her in public. The archive is not built to follow her. That absence is part of its power. The quiet continuations. A woman acquitted does not necessarily return to the life she had. Respectability can be damaged beyond repair. Marriage can become unlivable. Employment can vanish. Neighbors remember. Landladies talk. A name can become a stain even when the law has declared her innocent. The court's judgment may end formally, but the social verdict can persist without appeal. A woman convicted does not simply serve time. She is moved through institutions designed for containment, not restoration. Her identity is flattened into administration. The routine of custody replaces the routine of home. Letters are controlled. Visits are rationed. Health can worsen. Children can be lost. By the time she returns, if she returns, she may find that her old life has rearranged itself without her. A woman declared mentally unfit or managed under the language of illness enters a different kind of disappearance. The public may call it mercy. The lived reality can be indefinite control, the replacement of legal judgment with institutional judgment, the slow erosion of personhood beneath the category of patient. The record often stops at the pivot and offers no further witness. These are the continuations the Old Bailey does not record, yet they are part of what the court did. What a case becomes in public memory. Some women become famous. Most do not. For the women who become famous, those whose names still echo, the afterlife is shaped by repetition. The case is retold as lesson or entertainment. Details are chosen for drama. Motives are simplified. Complexity is stripped away. The woman becomes a figure in a moral story that belongs to the crowd more than to the truth. This is particularly sharp in cases that involve domestic roles: the nurse, the servant, the wife, the mother. These are roles Victorian society wanted to keep stable. When a woman in one of these roles is accused of harm, the public story tends to harden quickly, because hardening restores the comfort of clear categories. The record becomes evidence. The retelling becomes certainty. The danger of reading the archive too smoothly. A printed trial account can feel authoritative simply because it exists. The danger is that the reader mistakes the court's clarity for reality's clarity. The record is a product of procedure, selection, and power. It preserves voices but not equally. It preserves the facts the law needed, not the facts a life would choose to keep. It preserves a particular kind of truth, the truth that can survive a courtroom. That does not make it worthless. It makes it sharp. It shows, with unusual clarity, the social assumptions that were allowed into legal reasoning. To read it well requires resisting two temptations. The first is to treat the record as pure fact and forget its moral atmosphere. The second is to treat the record as mere prejudice and forget it contains real harms, real deaths, real injuries, real losses. The task is to hold both, the violence of the acts and the violence of the interpretations. What remains consistent across the 7 women? Catherine Wilson is processed as a betrayal of trust inside the sickroom. Adelaide Bartlett is processed as a respectable surface that must be explained. Kate Webster is processed as a working-class presence made plausible for guilt. Mary Piercy is processed as spectacle and warning. Christiana Edmonds is processed as mind, as pathology, as managed danger. Amelia Dyer is processed as isolated monstrosity that protects the wider system. The Penge household is processed as domestic cruelty translated into a ledger of control. The cases differ, but the machinery repeats. Women are judged through their roles. Their bodies are read as evidence. Their motives are simplified into familiar scripts. Their voices are weighed against expert authority and social class. Their stories are made to end neatly even when their lives did not. That repetition is the real subject of this book. Why the Old Bailey still matters. The Old Bailey archive endures because it preserves a society speaking under pressure. It reveals what Victorian England feared about women, that they might want money, that they might want freedom, that they might want a lover, that they might refuse their role, that they might use domestic access for harm, that they might collapse under strain, that they might become ungovernable. It reveals what the culture needed women to be in order for its moral order to feel stable: caretakers, moderating forces, reliable centers of home. When women did not fit that need, or were accused of not fitting it, the court did not simply decide guilt. It decided meaning. The record does not give justice to every life within it. It cannot. What it can do is show how judgment was made, and how often that judgment rested on assumptions that were treated as natural. To read these cases now is to see the machinery plainly, the conversion of private life into public evidence, the use of respectability and class as interpretive tools, the medical takeover of female transgression, the hunger for motives that keep social comfort intact, the way a woman can be punished in tone before she is punished in law. After the record, the women themselves disappear into whatever lives remain to them. The archive does not follow. The reader can. Not to rescue them with imagined interiority, but to refuse the comfort of believing that the system's endings were true endings, and to recognize, in the court's language, the deeper story it accidentally preserved, how Victorian justice looked at women, decided what it was seeing, and acted accordingly. Bibliography. Primary sources: trials and court publications. Old Bailey Proceedings Online. The Proceedings of the Old Bailey, 1674 to 1913. Old Bailey Proceedings Online. Christiana Edmonds, Trial Reference T187201008-185. Old Bailey Proceedings Online. Adelaide Bartlett, Trial Reference T188604005-466. Old Bailey Proceedings Online. Amelia Elizabeth Dyer, Trial Reference T189600518-451. Old Bailey Proceedings Online. Mary Piercy, Trial Reference T1890112-43. Old Bailey Proceedings Online. Kate Webster, Trial Reference T187906330-653. Bartlett, Adelaide Blanche, de la Tremoille. The trial of Adelaide Bartlett for murder, held at the Central Criminal Court from Monday, April 12, to Saturday, April 17, 1886. Edited by Edward Beale. London, 1886. Internet Archive. Hall, Sir John Richard, edition Trial of Adelaide Bartlett. New York, J. Day Company, 1927. Hathi Trust Catalogue Record. Wilson, Catherine. Life, Trial, Sentence, and Execution of Catherine Wilson. 19th Century Broadside. Harvard Library, Crime Broadsides Collection. Primary sources: The National Archives, UK. Criminal Court Cases, Old Bailey, Central Criminal Court. Digital Panopticon. Old Bailey Proceedings 1740 to 1913, Strengths and Limitations. Digital Panopticon. Amelia Elizabeth Dyer, Life Archive, OBDEF 1-451-189600518. Old Bailey Proceedings Online. About the Proceedings. Secondary sources: Court, Punishment, and Victorian Crime. Emsley, Clive. Crime and Society in England, 1750 to 1900. 3rd edition London, Longman/Pearson, 2005. Gattrell, V.A.C. The Hanging Tree, Execution and the English People, 1770 to 1868. Oxford, Oxford University Press, 1994. Linnebaugh, Peter. The London Hanged, Crime and Civil Society in the 18th Century. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1992. Wiener, Martin J. Men of Blood, Violence, Manliness and Criminal Justice in Victorian England. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 2004. Flanders, Judith. The Invention of Murder, How the Victorians Revelled in Death and Detection and Created Modern True Crime. London, Harper Press, 2011. Secondary sources: Women, Insanity, Narrative Framing, and Press. Bridges, Yusselt. Poison and Adelaide Bartlett, The Pimlico Poisoning Case. London, Hutchinson and Company, 1962. Jones, K. The Case of the Chocolate Cream Killer, The Poisonous Passion of Christiana Edmonds. Barnsley, Pen and Sword, 2016. Brighton and Hove Museums. Death by Chocolate. Berkshire Record Office. Christiana Edmonds, 1829 to 1907. Old Bailey Reference Numbers. Catherine Wilson. Old Bailey Trial, T186209222-996, September 22, 1862. Adelaide Bartlett. Old Bailey Trial, T188604005-466, April 5, 1886. Kate Webster. Old Bailey Trial, T18790630653, June 30, 1879. Mary Piercy. Old Bailey Trial, T1890112-43, November 24, 1890. Christiana Edmonds. Old Bailey Trial, T1872010-185, January 8, 1872. Amelia Dyer. Old Bailey Trial, T189600518-451, May 18, 1896. The Penge Case, Harriet Staunton, multiple defendants. This case has separate trial entries for the co-defendants. One confirmed Old Bailey ID is Louis Adolphus Edward Staunton, trial T187709117-672, September 17, 1877. Alice Rhodes, T187709117-672. Patrick Llewellyn Staunton, T187709117-672. Elizabeth and Staunton, T187709117-672.